This presentation provides a brief introduction to cycles. We all hear about cycles and experience them, of course. We experience a daily cycle, monthly cycle, a yearly cycle. In astrology and numerology, there are many types of cycles, and so I'll briefly illustrate what that looks like so you have a better idea of what it means, because again, people hear about them and talk about them and we all understand the basic cycles, but there are deep destiny cycles that unfold in our life, and it's the job of astrology, or the task of astrology and numerology, to measure when those cycles occur and what we experience when they do come to new beginning or culmination is key synchronistic turning points in our life. And that's what we're after understanding, so we can be more aware and work more consciously and cooperatively with them. And that's very much what astrology is about, in addition, and numerology, to the deeper themes of destiny that are at play. So the timing itself of cycles is significant. It's more the linear side, where the themes are the deeper, richer psycho-spiritual aspect, but can also be understood to have practical applications. So in numerology, numerology measures cycles in a somewhat more linear fashion. We can understand largely there's many cycles in numerology as well as astrology, but basically 7, 9, and 13-year cycles are very strong, and which I work with in particular. But there are other lengths of cycles as well. Those three are very, very strong. 10-year cycles, which most people are more familiar with, like when you're 10, 20, 30, etc., those are more generic, and we celebrate those birthdays, but when it comes to a deeper understanding of cycles, they don't amount to as much, ironically. They do play a role, though, and so they're not to be dismissed. After all, when we begin a new decade, there's its own new beginning. So definitely the 10, 20, and 30, those 10-year cycles do play a role in numerology. But in astrology, we are sort of looking at it more technically. Again, astrology and numerology speak to each other very closely. I like to refer to them as the brother and the sister, where the numerology would be the sister. And what we're looking at is a more technical array of planetary alignments. So when we think of a cycle, we can compare it obviously and easily to a circle or a sphere. Speaking of a circle, the two-dimensional representation, we can begin to study into the basis of the zodiac. The zodiac means the circle of life, or the wheel of life, and technically incorporates a 360 degree principle. Within a degree, by the way, there's 60 minutes, and within a minute there's 60 seconds, just like a clock. And so we can basically understand then, when we look at the 12 signs of the zodiac, the circle divided by 12, we get 30-degree segments. So sometimes it's a bit dizzying when you look at a chart and you see all the planets and angles and house cusps at very specific degrees. But one thing you can be sure of, they'll never be more than 30. And that's a significant start point to understanding how to, better understand how to read them and not be overwhelmed by all the numbers that one will see there. Now, there's three key points when a cycle begins, and that is when there's a conjunction of any two planets. From the standpoint of us here on Earth, we see an alignment of two planets, and the classical sort of foundational or archetypal foundation for a cycle begins with the sun and moon forming a new moon, and certainly in some cases an eclipse, which incorporates the plane of the ecliptic. But we'll talk about that in another presentation. When a planet enters the sign of Aries, and the reason that that's true is because Aries is the first sign of the zodiac, so when a planet enters Aries, it begins a whole new cycle through the zodiac. Then when a planet enters any new sign, and that's basically a sub-cycle of the larger cycle of Aries to Pisces. So say a planet enters Gemini, it's entering definitely a new cycle within the scope of that sign. but it can be understood as a sub-cycle within the larger context. So there's 3 ways of measuring the beginning of a cycle. And now it should be noted that a cycle can also be attributed to, once again, the foundation of a cycle is like a conjunction or an ingress. Ingress is when the planet enters the new sign. When it comes to a conjunction, we can see parallel principles. A conjunction equals new moon, equals winter solstice, equals midnight. This understanding has value at deeper levels of astrology. It's fairly simple, but it's still, at first glance, it's not familiar to people that, oh, those are parallel principles. Oh, why? And it's because each one of them begin a new round, like a conjunction of planets, like a new moon, or any other 2 planets begins a new cycle. And again, it's true of an ingress, but winter solstice begins the annual cycle in the natural world, not the calendar, which is more of a socially sort of contrived tool, a good tool, and it does have an astronomical basis to it, and astrology does incorporate that tool. But when we look at the natural cycle of things and we measure, we can see that winter solstice represents the shortest day of the year, and in fact the beginning of the sun cycle, the waxing of the sunlight, culminating at summer solstice, of course. 12 midnight is the other one, which begins the day. Technically, there's sort of 2 beginnings of the day. One's at midnight, one's at 6 in the morning. It's just interesting. 12 midnight would parallel winter solstice, but 6 a.m. would parallel spring equinox. And some calendars focus on, the winter solstice, while others on the spring equinox. So it's a bit tricky that way. So there's a bit of a theme that there's 2 beginnings of the day, but officially, technically, it is, in fact, midnight. Now, this briefly is an indication of just when a planet or 2 planets are conjunct, forming a new cycle. And what we have is Jupiter and Uranus. Now, I'm showing this chart in particular because it's not only a conjunction of 2 planets at 0 degrees 17 Aries, but it's in Aries. So we have a conjunction, that's one measurement of a new cycle, and in Aries. Very significant to have that. And by the way, that cycle continues to unfold to this day. It's not complete yet. So that's a very important background theme for our times, and is indicative of why we're experiencing so many changes in the world, or synchronistically. See, astrology is not about making things happen, by the way. It's not the planets are influencing what's happening, which is a term we often use. It's just a common consideration. The planets are influencing it. No, the planets are revealing the synchronicity. It's a very important understanding that the planets, from the standpoint of physics, don't cause the effect. They're more, in a metaphysical way, organs within a larger body of reality, but you have to think holistically, and it's a different metaphysical paradigm that one needs to incorporate. But won't go too deeply into that at this moment, but it is an interesting consideration here that the planets aren't so much influencing us, although that is true of the sun and moon. They do have a physics-based influence, and it is true that the planetary energies will work through the sun and moon, so that's where it does come through in the physics sense. But the larger background of all the planets, etc., don't purely have energetic forces that are zapping the Earth. People sometimes think that there's sort of like cosmic rays coming from the planets or the stars. The notion of cosmic rays is kooky to especially an astronomer or in science. And so, there's a much more gravitational or radiation principle with the moon and sun. It's true, but it's not cosmic rays. So please get that out of your mind. Now, another factor of ingress here is, for example, coming up, this presentation being done prior to this event, 1 month prior approximately. So what we have is Chiron entering Aries. So that's just an indication of a planet entering a new sign, Aries in particular, beginning a new cycle. So that's just a little example of that. Now, on occasion, there will be a triple conjunction. Now, people sometimes hear about that, and it's much more rare, especially to have an exact triple. Now, it just so happens on May 23rd, 2009, there was a triple conjunction. And that conjunction was between Chiron, Jupiter, and Neptune, all at 26 degrees. But technically, you'll notice that they're not the same minute. So while they are largely, forming a conjunction, it's true, technically they're not. And astrology sometimes does get icky-picky, gets very Virgo, shall we say, very technical. So technically here we have a Jupiter-Chiron conjunction, and Neptune's a part of it, indeed, but not by exact degree. But then a little bit later, just a few days, in fact, Jupiter did in fact form an exact conjunction with Neptune. So that just shows you a small degree of distinction where we measure, there was a triple planetary alignment at that conjunction. That's true, but technically it was those two planets that began a new cycle, and then Jupiter conjuncting Chiron and then Jupiter conjuncting Neptune is another cycle. So although they sit side by side, they're different cycles and they have different time periods. The duration of time between a Jupiter Chiron versus a Jupiter Neptune is different, and that's a rather significant. It's not hugely different, but it's enough to say it's distinctly something else. So those are some of the finer points. This very briefly would be just an intro to a larger discussion of the periodicity of conjunctions of far planets. It can seem a little geeky, but it's fairly simple in the fact that you see the far planets include Jupiter, Chiron, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. And I didn't include Chiron. Chiron has a special role in astrology, which I'm not going to get into right now. I did want to show that there was a triple conjunction and included it, but we're going to avoid the Chiron discussion at this moment. But the main thing is that the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto cycles, and that's being illustrated. See, Jupiter conjunct all of them, then Saturn conjunct the further ones, then Uranus conjunct Neptune and Pluto, then Neptune conjunct Pluto, which is a tidy, well, it's not always 500 years. And you'll notice there's some approximates here. That should say approximate as well right there, and I'll add that in a moment. But the main point is because of the elliptical orbits of the planets, they don't always happen at the exact same interval of time. Okay, so the relationship between them varies in terms of when the cycle begins. But they do have an approximate period of time, and these conjunctions represent new cycles which represent important background themes. So although there's a lot of them, it is rather finite. At some moment you can go, that's it, there we go, that's them. So that's important to consider right on that point alone. In another video where I'm going to show discuss more about the conjunctions of Jupiter and Jupiter and Neptune for 2019, you'll get a closer idea of some of these principles. Oops. Yeah. One thing I can add to this theme right here, once again, the planets each in their pairs producing cycles represent important cycles that are background themes to larger realities, and they all together sort of like a symphony of each one an instrument, each one a different creature. That can be illustrated this way. This is just an example, just a metaphor, that each cycle has its own quality. It's like an instrument in a symphony. Each are similar in a sense, or at least they all make sound in that, but they're different creatures. And every cycle, even the Jupiter cycle, let's say with Saturn, the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which occurs every 20 years, each time, every one is a different creature. It's not quite the same. It's the same two planets, but and they have the same duration, 20 years, just shy of 20 years. But each time you have to look at the larger backdrop of planetary alignment, which I'll show you in a moment. So, by the way, winter solstice, as mentioned briefly, is the beginning of the natural new year. Just want to mention that. Also, we could measure the cycle in terms of an anatomy of a cycle. I call this the anatomy of a cycle. So you can look at any cycle as having a waxing and waning principle. So up here, like the winter solstice equaling the new moon, which is the conjunction of the sun and moon, and then waxing. You'll see the numbers here, 1, 2, 3. It's a waxing principle coming to full, symbolic of summer solstice. You'll see at the bottom. And then waning. So there's a waxing and waning aspect to the cycles, and the culmination, the full moon or the opposition aspect, is when it culminates and it comes to a very powerful point. So as we see here, keeping it a little simpler, that anatomy of a cycle gets a little bit more detailed and geeky in terms of the implications. But it does, what this does show is it has sort of an organic principle. You see there's an emergence at the beginning of a new moon, for example. There's a germination, a rebirth, a new vision, like a germination process that then begins to sprout buds and then goes through a process of change and breakthrough flowers, and then it goes through developing fruit, and the fruit ripens on the vine, so to speak, and so forth. So you get this organic principle within the measurement of cycles. At least that's available. Some people will take the organic perspective, which works, or you can take a more psychological perspective, or you can take a more eventful perspective. All three are valid and will be used in the course of assessing one particular cycle. Now, a conjunction is when there's, again, two planets aligned, but we see here that this symbol, by the way, is a symbol for the earth. It shows a circle of spirit encasing the cross of matter. Very beautiful symbol, that one, but we won't go too deeply into the discussion of symbols. That's saved for another presentation, just to give you some little background here. But we do see that the counterclockwise motion of the cycle shows the waxing square. So the conjunction reaches its 90-degree point, and that's a critical turning point. And then the opposition point is the culmination, and the waning 90-degree point is a critical turning point. So these are the four main stations in a cycle, and they can be, the circle can be squared if you like. So in other words, you can draw a linear straight line here and a linear straight line here. So you get this basic idea that you can square the circle as another kind of conversation, but that the turning points are very angular, very sharp. And and they can, by the way, be compared, as you can see, like the four elements are within the cycle: earth, air, and fire, water, or the four elements, the four angles: north, south, east, and west. You get the 6-12 on the clock principle. You know, sorry, the 3-6-9-12, that's more accurate. 3-6-9-12 on the clock. So you get these major turning points, the quarters of the cycle. So that basically provides a bit of a background to help you at least have a start point to better understand that, oh yeah, cycles, they have a certain deeper story behind them. And in astrology, we, are applying these in a more psychospiritual way. We're looking at what they mean in your life, when they occur, when they culminate, when they come to critical turning points, and these all manifest as outer synchronicities. It's a beautiful thing to see that. And it can be very, of course, practically helpful for people to understand that that's what's going on, because it's tempting and natural for us to look at things and interpret them from a purely outer, random, circumstantial perspective. Okay, but actually there's synchronicities at play. There's a deeper rhyme and reason. There's a plan. There's what's called a destiny. And that when these changes that occur in our lives, sometimes they do catch us by surprise. Even astrologers and numerologists who study them closely, just because they study the map, it doesn't mean they have full comprehension or insight into the territory or the deeper destiny. But, it is part of the art and practice and science to measure the what and the when of the cycles. So there you go, a bit of intro into the cycles. So hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, just please send me an email on those, sunstarastrology@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer them. And Thanks for your time. Okay, see you next time.